The new reality. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so, okay, now I'm starting. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our PDW. And I'm Semi Min, and I'm a PhD student at NYU Stern. And I'm very happy to introduce our PDW, the rise of computational methods for theory development. And luckily in this session, we were able to have amazing scholars who spent their time on conducting interesting research with novel computational methods. And I'm pretty sure that this session will offer valuable insights to the scholars who want to incorporate computational methods in their research for theory building purpose. So before we move on, I'd like to introduce our amazing organizers. So Hila Ripsis Asaf from New York University and Aaron Lindberg from Stevens Institute of Technology. And they made an amazing effort to lay out the agenda and coordinating overall process. And all these scholars conducted interesting studies using computational methods to extend organizational theory and IS research, right? So the role of data has become particularly prominent because various aspects of our social lives are captured through digital traces than ever before. So anticipating that this data will advance our knowledge about organizations and the market, the researchers have become excited about using large-scale data for their research. So witnessing the huge potential of the data, some early efforts have been made by information system scholars, especially by our amazing panelists today. And they studied a wide variety of interesting phenomena, such as routines and coordination mechanism and knowledge production, and collective action and digital platform ecosystems and diffusion of innovation. Right? And we all agree that these studies made amazing progress in our field, but some challenges still remain to be addressed. Therefore, in order to progress this new field of research, we thought that it is very important to bring together scholars to share their challenges and experience and thoughts. So to this end, following my introduction, there will be a methodological overview for 15 minutes by Aaron Lindberg from Stevens University, and Nicholas Garcia from New York University. And they will outline various novel methods used in IS research for theory development and discuss how this method can be utilized for process research. And after this, we will have some time to showcase the recent studies from scholars in our field for about 50 minutes. And we allocate about like 12 minutes for each presentation. And Brian Pentland from Michigan State University will talk about his new interest in research using simulations and network analysis for studying routine dynamics. And Shayla Miranda from University of Oklahoma will showcase her new studies that aims to unpack the meaning formation around innovation using text analytics. And Youngjin Yu from Case Western will talk about his recent work on evolutionary dynamics in digital platform and online communities. And lastly, I will talk about my work in progress research that studied the evolution of discourse around the emerging technology using text analytics method. And then after these presentations, we will have a breakout room discussion. And all the panelists will serve as a facilitator in the breakout rooms and have a time to reflect on presentations and collect questions from the participants. And before the breakout room session, we will send you a Google Doc link to everyone, and participants and panelists will add questions to the document, which will be asked to panelists during the discussion. And then we will have a short break for 5 minutes. And after the break, we will have a discussion among our panelists, and our panelists are Brian Pentland and Youngjin Yu and Shayla Miranda, Stephen Seidel from University of Liechtenstein. And the discussion will be moderated by Natalia Levina from New York University. And after the panel discussion, our organizer, Aaron Lindberg, will have an ending ceremony for 10 minutes. Right, and this is the agenda of our PDW, and I hope you all enjoy this event. Thank you. Yeah, so our next presenter is Aaron Lindberg, and he will talk about the various computational methods that can be used for different type of research for theory development. Aaron, are you here?
I'm
Aaron?
here. Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
yeah. Can you please share the slide?
Perfect.
Yeah.
Do you, are you sharing the slides on your end, or should I share it on my end?
Oh, please, please share your slide on your end.
The slide, that's it. So Semi, is this showing up properly?
Yeah.
Great.
Perfect.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Semi. I especially thank you for using this beautiful picture of me with all my hair. That picture may or may not be 15 years old, but you know, I take what I get. So thank you so much for that. So I'm going to talk for just a few minutes about some of the things that have already been achieved methodologically within this area in the last few years, and there's been various efforts, and there's obviously people like Brian, who's going to talk to us later, who's been doing this not necessarily under this name, but doing this type of work for a very, very long time. But it seems like in the last 10, maybe 5 years, it's reached sort of a fever pitch where more and more people have started to pay attention to computational methods, to using digital traces, big data, etc. And some of us within the information systems field who've always been concerned with theory building. For us, this was a challenge that we readily accepted. And by challenge, I mean that the first people who started to adapt these types of methods were largely people who came from social network analysis backgrounds, who had machine learning backgrounds, statisticians, etc. And many of these scholars, they came at this type of research from an angle that was not necessarily aimed towards developing new theory. Often it was a more deductive mindset, a mindset with regards to testing hypotheses that could be derived from the literature, which is a great research approach. But for those of us who felt this drive to develop theory, to provide new insights that were not necessarily deducible from the extant literature, it felt as if there was something that was missing. So myself, a number of my colleagues, as well as some other people who I don't work with personally, have worked to formalize methodological descriptions of how you can utilize computational methods, and often in concert with those computational methods, available digital trace data or even big data sets, how you can use these things to develop theory, putting theory building at the center of this effort, and viewing computational methods and digital traces as a way to build a better theory. And I want to spend just a few minutes to provide an overview of some of the things, provide a non-exhaustive list of some of the things that have already been done, that have been formalized, and that have been published in our journals. And my suggestion is that there are essentially 3 points of departure into how different scholars have approached this work. And largely, I think people have approached it from the established research traditions that they were raised in or were educated in. And they have tried to extend those research towards this new goal of developing theory using computational methods. So I'm very briefly going to say that there are those who've had started this journey with a qualitative mindset, those who've had quantitative methods as their point of departure, and those who have had mixed methods as their point of departure. So these are 3 slightly different ways of approaching the same thing, which is building theory using computational methods. I'm going to describe them one by one, the way I see them, and then provide an example of a publication that utilizes or have described this approach methodologically. So first, obviously, traditionally, people who have cared about developing theory have been heavily engaged in qualitative research, right? So there's a traditional association between qualitative researchers and theory development. I think that this is PDW shows that this is not a necessary correlation any longer, but I do think that a lot of people have focused on qualitative research as a means for theory development in the past. And a basic logic of this type of research has often been grounded theory method, meaning that you develop theories that are grounded in the data. And usually the approach that has been done is to build lexica, so a lexicon of multiple concepts that are connected by some coherent framing, and to build such sets of concepts that can be interrelated from each other from the data in an inductive fashion. And this type of methodological approach to theory development using computational tools has often focused on conceptual development, right? It's very strong in developing concepts. And the overall strength of this type of approach to theory building using computational model is that it leads to very strong concept or construct validity, in the sense that the concepts are deeply grounded in the data, and that they're thoughtfully developed in order to connect to a theoretical discourse, but also to connect to the empirical data that is available. Now, all research has weaknesses, and my argument is that this approach to theory development using computational tools has been less focused on the relationships between it's a stronger tool for developing concepts and building them from the ground up, but provides less advice on how to connect different concepts to each other, for example, a causal theory. An important example of this approach to theory development using computational tools is Berente, Seidel, and Safadi's paper from 2019, which they call data-driven computational theory development. And later on in this workshop, you'll have the chance to listen to Stefan Seidel, who will be a panelist, and he can obviously talk about this paper and his overall experiences with this form of research. Now, at the center of the approach that they put forward in their 2019 paper was this idea of a lexicon. Right? The idea that you have a conceptual framing that allows you to develop multiple concepts that are consistent with each other, that can be logically connected to each other, and that those concepts derive from the world, the data that you gather of the world, and that you can then use these concepts to build associations between the concepts, which then results in theory. And very much this was an approach to saying, let's take grounded theory method. Say, how would you apply grounded theory method to digital trace data using computational tools? And their argument, which I find is very convincing, is that you can actually map it quite well, right? Because data is data, and computational tools are actually inductive in their basic operation many of the time. So the grounded theory method actually translates fairly well into using computational tools. So that's the first point of departure, which is approaching this challenge from a qualitative perspective. Now, some other researchers have approached this from a quantitative perspective. I don't want to stereotype quantitative researchers. I do quantitative research myself, by saying that all quantitative researchers are positivist, deductive, hypothesis testing scholars, right? I think this is an old stereotype. Maybe this was true 20, 30 years ago. I don't think it's true any longer. But quantitative research and the tradition around that type of research, especially with the emergence of machine learning, provides an important point of departure for how we can develop theory using computational tools. And the overall logic of this type of research, it derives from machine learning, right? The idea that using algorithms, we can identify predictors of outcomes in an inductive fashions, and we can create models which maximizes various goodness of fit measures, whether they're complexity adjusted or not, automatically, right? So the approach is an algorithmic approach that identifies predictive relationships. I don't want to say automatic, because I know that this type of work is not automatic at all, but it is algorithmic. And the emphasis of this type of theory development has often been on the identification of statistical relationships. And therefore, a strength of this approach is what I would call internal validity, right? It's very good at establishing connections between concepts, to establishing causality using econometric standards of modeling. But on the other hand, this type of approach eschews conceptual development in the sense that it's much weaker in terms of the guidelines that it provides for us on how to develop concepts. Sometimes we see in publications that the digital traces themselves are used as the concepts. For example, one might measure the number of connections on a social networking platform and whether the number of connections predicts some particular behavior, such as purchasing a product, etc. Right? That's a sort of very economic approach that relies on a very thin conceptualization of concepts. So that is, I would argue, a weakness of this particular approach. An example, methodologically speaking, of this type of research is a recent paper by Shrestha et al. In Organization Science. And they put forth this idea that they call algorithm-supported induction for theory building. And they are using predictive modeling, and they're automating their predictive modeling algorithmically in such a way that they identify what are the most important predictors of from some particular dependent variable, and through complexity adjusted goodness of fit measures and various types of bootstrapping and robustness checks techniques, they can establish models which help to achieve a high statistical goodness of fit, but at the same time not being overly complex to the degree to which they become difficult to interpret, right? So this is a very interesting new approach to developing theory, which is very much algorithmically driven, but then again pays less attention to conceptual development. Either the conceptual development is presupposed and then translated into a data set, or the digital traces themselves are used as the concepts as is. So that's the third or the second approach to theory developmental methods that's already been established in the literature. And the last point of departure that I want to talk to you about is mixed methods. Mixed methods has obviously been around for a long time. It started with essentially trying to mix qualitative research with survey-based regression research back in the day. But increasingly, it's become obvious that you can also mix computational methods, digital traces, and various computational methods with qualitative research in order to create new theory. And the overall logic of this type of research is iterative abduction. You move back and forth between different types of data, different types of methods, and hence you're following an approach of generating and testing working hypothesis, right? So you're continuously making assessments of what you think one particular type of method or one particular type of data is going to reveal, and then you test it, and then you kind of engage in that cycle until you achieve a tight fit between your theory, qualitative methods, and quantitative methods of the data that they have. And the emphasis here is obviously on cross-validation of concepts on relations. Right? You're able to sort of triangulate different types of data with different types of methods. And that means that a strength of this type of research is external validity, right? You can look at the phenomena from multiple perspectives, and therefore there is a high likelihood that the conceptual identifications and theoretical propositions that you generate will also be valid outside that particular research study in the real world. So a traditional strength that qualitative research has often been associated with. This type of research obviously has a weakness because you're mixing multiple methods, multiple approaches. You also have a potential for excessive complexity, and you may sometimes struggle with getting together reviews, able to understand the full width of the different methods that you're applying. And a recent example of this type of research, it's my own paper from 2020, which is a mixed methods paper talking about how different types of what I refer to as pattern recognition human pattern recognition and machine pattern recognition, qualitative and quantitative methods, how they can be tied together in this iterative process of generating and testing working hypothesis and then developing a theory that makes sure that you can align all your different observations, methods, and data to each other with a theoretical account that then makes sense of that totality. So these are the three different points of departure that I currently see in the literature. We're going to have discussions later today, and I'd be very excited to hear if people see additional points of departure beyond these three, which I wouldn't be surprised if there are. But these are three clear points of departure that a lot of the work has done so far. And I think it's important to recognize this because each of them has distinct strengths and distinct contributions to our joint efforts of developing better theory using computational methods. So that's all I have to say. I want to turn over the microphone next to Nicholas Garcia, who's also trying to push the envelope with more exciting ideas in this domain.
All right, thank you, Aaron, for giving us a great introduction to everything that's going on here. For my part, I'm going to try to tee up a little bit of the conversation, hopefully, that the panelists will talk about. And I'll be kind of building on the kind of frameworks that Aaron just talked about for computational theory building to talk about computational process theory building. And given some of the kind of interest in the community, this will be a little bit of a how-to, but of course it will be a little bit condensed in time because of where we are all at. So in terms of kind of conceptualizing the theory building process, there's many different ways, and Aaron kind of laid out several kind of good ways of thinking about it, and kind of riffing off of this kind of grounded theory method that kind of provides some overall steps for the theory building process. I've kind of condensed some of the theory building steps into just these three, and kind of it's helpful to have these steps when we think about when we're going through the research process ourselves, where are all of the places that we can fit in computational methods, kind of as Aaron showed as well in terms of kind of this human and machine pattern recognition. So I've condensed it down into three steps. The first being data collection and coding, second being kind of exploration and discovery. So kind of after as your data has been coded, you're kind of looking through it to try to find out what's the interesting patterns there. And of course, finally, kind of theoretical saturation and verification, where you kind of try to, as you build your models or your theories, you kind of go back and try to find things that surprise you or find things that, you know, don't quite fit with your model. And then, you know, hopefully you kind of go back to the data, go back to the coding and kind of build a stronger model and verify that it kind of makes sense. And this kind of idea of applying grounded theory to computational methods is not, you know, I'm not the only one to have this idea. Kind of all the way back to Berente, they kind of have a very good way of understanding kind of from the raw data, how do you kind of build higher and higher level models all the way up to theory. And so I kind of put this a little bit towards the category I call kind of data collection and coding, but of course in their paper as well, they kind of talk, of course, a little bit about the process of as you build these codes and models and everything, you are of course doing this exploration and discovery process. You are of course doing this theoretical saturation and verification process as you kind of go back to the codes and kind of build higher and higher order kind of theory. But kind of bringing in process theory to talk about this, we might ask ourselves really what is process theory? There's kind of many different kinds. There's a wide diversity. For those of you who are kind of a little more junior, not knowing why process theory is useful, hopefully this will kind of give you a little bit of a map of the different kinds of ideas out there. So according to Langley and Tsoukas 2010, there's kind of three main distinctions along which process theory is defined or characterized. And on any of these, if you kind of choose the process option, you're a process theory, but any process theory can be kind of a combination of any kind of fall anywhere on these like sets of distinctions. So the first set of distinction is a narrative versus a scientific or logical epistemology. That's kind of the first question I think you should ask yourself when you're starting a paper. Narrative being the kind of, are you prioritizing the point of view and the stories of the kind of participants themselves and the kind of telling their story from their point of view, and the scientific logical kind of perspective, paradigm, epistemology is kind of more talking to scholars and presenting abstract concepts and the relationships between concepts and kind of abstracting from the particular case itself a little bit. This kind of process versus substance ontology is important for process theorists. And the question is whether kind of the fundamental units of analysis themselves are this processual, are the actions and processes that we're kind of looking at themselves, or we're kind of taking discrete entities and maybe putting them into a process, but we kind of consider things, to be individual people or organizations or what have you that are interacting amongst each other. That would be kind of more substance ontology. And then finally, we could ask ourselves, are we building a variance model, which kind of tries to have statistical assurances that there's some correlation between some of the kind of concepts we're bringing up, or are we building a process model, which is kind of more showing the temporal relationship between things and kind of presenting really just how things either evolved in this one case or tended to evolve overall. So to kind of bring in where computational fits into these, I think, and we kind of can go back to our overall theory of the idea of how the steps that we go through when we're building processes, and so and then look at the computational theory building on each step. So for first, the data collection and coding process, we ask ourselves, if we're building a narrative versus a scientific model, then we might have different kinds of data. So for a narrative model, we collect much more text data. Maybe we kind of have the organizational trace data, but we're embedded with the human beings that we can interview once we get some interesting ideas. So we kind of get this like rich data from them. Whereas maybe a scientific logical approach would be to have some concepts such as, I care about the variance of theories that I'll like find coded in some routines. And so it's kind of an abstract concept that you can, are kind of trying to apply to the data sets that you have. For the process versus substance ontology, is like, are you coding discrete things that are clumped together? That maybe is a little bit more of a process, a substance kind of point of view. And of course, we can use many computational methods like clustering to do this. Or are we kind of looking at something over time and seeing like, how does this particular action or particular process like show up over time? Or how does, are we looking as our kind of fundamental unit of analysis going to be something that's evolving over time that will change how the data we collect and how we code it? And finally, for variance versus process models, we can ask what kind of models we're using. And so again, on this kind of process versus substance side, we can think of, even using text, something like topic modeling might be something discrete that would then track over time with these kind of, time series analysis, but we can even have a like more kind of temporally aware kind of topic models, concept builders that will find the evolution of a topic itself in part of its definition. So depending on the kind of assumptions you're willing to make or wanting to make, you can choose different algorithms to do these things. And then kind of riffing off of what Aaron said about if we're kind of trying to match the variance itself, we might be building, predictive models to say like, really try to get the models that we make to fit really well to the data, versus if we're kind of just caring about looking at how things evolve over time. Then, for example, like this word embedding paper, we can just look at really it's not about the fit per se, but kind of given how we code the data, we can see some interesting evolutions over time. This picture is like the word gay and the associations that it has to other words over time using word embeddings. In terms of the second step, in terms of like exploration and discovery, a narrative model, narrative paper might zoom in a lot more. It might use this like kind of maps of the space much more as a way for us to kind of see all of the data we have temporally, see all the data we have kind of maybe geographically, or however kind of it's a kind of social network, kind of where in the space we are, and then zoom in and get the rich data of anything that's important to us. Whereas a scientific point of view will kind of maybe zoom in just to confirm that it has the right concepts, but kind of zoom out and really kind of take a much more zoomed out approach. And so if we can have this map of the space, we can like zoom in or out both like temporally and maybe some other regions in the data. In terms of, again, the variance or process model, we're kind of going to ask ourselves what we're trying to capture. And so if we're kind of trying to capture these more processual models, we might use kind of workflow mining. It kind of is some overlap between the coding, process. Are the workflow kind of diagrams that we have going to be something like an end unit of analysis for us, or are they going to be something like some of a Brian Pentland's papers, where they kind of create a way for us just to see what's going on and then go back to the data and go back to interview real people and kind of say, given what we saw from this high level things that are going on, let's go back to them and try to make sense of it with the kind of human point of view. And then finally, with saturation and verification, I think this is a space that there's still a lot of work that can be done in terms of bringing computational methods to kind of process theory building, in terms of kind of the scientific logical point of view, and also variance point of view. We might be kind of looking at goodness of fit or the correlation between concepts. Whereas we're kind of if we're taking a narrative view, we might look at also the goodness of fit like over time, but also just kind of try to find subsets that kind of diverge from the overall pattern. And then maybe if we kind of dig into interviews or dig into the raw data ourselves, if we have lots of text data, then we can get some interesting explanations, rich quotes, and things like that. And finally, for the process versus variance model, of course, with a process model, we'll kind of end up kind of summary of what we find will be this more sequential, set of happenings or set of events kind of tied together, whereas the variance model will kind of be a little bit more of a correlation between the concepts that we see. So hopefully that gives a brief overview of how these kind of two worlds collide, this kind of computational theory building kind of work, and bringing in the kind of questions of process theory building. Of course, there's tons of more meat we could get into with the particular algorithms and how they should be applied in everybody's different case. But hopefully this presents a little bit of a map and stage for the people who are carrying onwards this work. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nicholas. And from now on, our presenters will talk about their recent works for about 50 minutes. And so Nicholas, can you please unshare your slide?
Of course.
And then our next presenter is Brian Pentland, and he will talk about his research on routine dynamics. So Brian, are you there?
Yeah, look, here I am, everybody. All right, I'm here. So if you want to see what I'm doing, you should pin me or go into speaker mode. I'm not going to share my screen because that way I can actually point to what I'm talking about. And I found that it's, yeah, like that. That's good. Thank you. Spotlight. So, so far people have been talking about the idea of collecting data in order to build theory. But I was asked to talk about theory building with simulation, which is just a fancy word for making up data. Right? Like who needs, right? So let's talk about that. You simulate, because you can cover the entire theoretical space. You can get all combinations of all parameters. You can compare extreme cases, right? If you want to get long trajectories and get detailed data on them, no problem. Just run it an extra, few minutes. If you want, you don't have to have any worries about access or confidentiality or statistical power. Just get yourself a proper computer, right? And there's other kinds of reasons. So another big one that the people, sort of the dirty secret about the trace data thing that everyone's so excited about, is that it's often a very distant shadow of what you're actually trying to understand. Okay, and people have written about this, but it's like watching the ground say, "Hey, look, I saw something happen." It's because birds were flying over. Well, that's trace data, so you don't see the birds, you see the shadows. And it can be great, but I just want to put that in as a caveat. So with simulation, what you're doing is saying, I want to actually control precisely where the birds fly because, I'm writing the code. Okay, so it's a whole different kind of mindset. Of course, the best reason to do it is because it's fun. Once you kind of get up to speed, it's kind of interesting. Downside, of course, is extremely difficult these days to publish, but we'll just skip over that because people are sometimes kind of skeptical. Anyway, there's a couple of big schools of thought on simulation just to get oriented. A nice summary of this is a chapter in our new forthcoming handbook on routine dynamics by Daewoo Gao. He does agent-based models of routines. But one school of thought says keep it simple, right? Another one is keep it descriptive. And what we mean by that, a simple simulation, abstract, generable, it's a runnable thought experiment. Imagine if people behave this way, what would happen, right? It's good for generating hypotheses, and it's generally conceptually grounded, right? So you take a cut theory like, principal agent theory or something like that, or some kind of economic thing about motivation, and you can kind of run through and see how it would work. Now, on the other side here, let me move around and do my weatherman thing. You have descriptive, right, where you have it concrete and specific, detailed, right? And with this, you can start to do, prediction, causal things. The metaphor of a digital twin is starting to be used in some of the process management literature, right? So something that's so descriptive that you can really model and predict how an organization is going to work. And so that is obviously empirically grounded, right? The idea of fit is there. Now, we're starting to see simulation based on neural networks, right? So the idea is you train a network to fit your data. So in process management, they're doing fabulous work. Like, I cannot overstate how well you can train a model to fit and simulate what's going to happen next. Okay, really good work. The thing about it, okay, is that there's no theory, model, or mechanism. It's just statistical, right? So it's definitely not KISS, because it's not simple at all. The model will have thousands of parameters. And it's definitely not descriptive, because there's nothing in it that describes anything that happened. It's just, given this sequence, what's the next item? So very interesting kind of thing. I'm going to sort of skip over this, but it's out there, right, as a computational thing. Simulation is also used to support causal inference. So if you can find an association in your data, empirical data, like you all have been talking about, if you can create a simulation that shows the same effect, it helps bolster your case for, if you can create a simulation that reproduces the effect that you see, it provides some insight on causality. So I've been working with my doctoral student, In-Kyu Kim, and Kwon Jang, one of our new assistant professors, on this project, where you can see here's a relationship in the real data between synchronization and duration of clinical visits, and here's the simulated data. It's not bad. It's like we think we understand what's going on. And here's why, because the simulation matches the actual phenomenon. So, so that's a very extreme example of this sort of detailed, keep it descriptive kind of simulation. The most influential simulations, okay, and this whole workshop here is about theory building, right? The ones that are the most powerful and influential have been simple and general. So Cohen and March, garbage can model of organizational choice. Bob Axelrod's Prisoner's Dilemma, Evolution of Cooperation, right? Jim March, Exploitation and Exploration. People might not realize that's a simulation paper, right? So these are all organizational simulations, and I would speculate, just guessing, that each one of these papers probably has more citations than all of us on this panel put together will ever have, right? And that's because of this. They're simple and they're general. The concept is what really counts. All right. So anyway, unfortunately, that style of thinking seems to be going out of style. Now it's all about agent-based modeling. And I was thrilled and amazed to discover that my little niche here is even on these charts. It's sort of funny. But so what I want to talk about, what they asked me to talk about briefly, is the idea of using simulation to understand changes over time in organizational routines. So we did this first back in 2012, like this, dynamics of organizational routines. And we used a model like this, where you have a network that represents a routine, and you use it to simulate performances of the routine. And then that feeds back into the network. So it's this recursive, and you find this in all kinds of social theory, from structuration theory to practice. It's a very common kind of idea, this recursive relationship between structure and action. All right. And you can extend this. Like I'm working on a paper now with Youngchin, where you say, well, here's the structure. What happens if we add some new technology in here? How is that going to change how the dynamics of this over time? But so the examples I want to talk to you about are the published ones, so you can look at it and read it if you want to. This is not an agent-based model, right? There are no individuals making decisions or processing information or any of that stuff that's typical of agent-based modeling, right? It's just one action feeds to the next. So routines change by adding and removing nodes and edges. in that network, right? And the performing and patterning is what gives you this recursive behavior that changes over time. And the thing about this is if you have to actually go and observe this, which I ethnographically go and watch people work, it's just not possible. You can't see what everybody does, and if you could do it for a day or two, try to do it for a year or two. The scope is just insane. It's just really hard to get data, and trace data gives you a kind of this distant view. So simulation provides a really strong grasp on the phenomenon. All right, so that's what my claim would be. So in the original version of this paper, we sort of demonstrated with the simulation that variation, retention, and selection, with these basic evolutionary concepts, account for the basic characteristics of organizational routines, such as formation, inertia, endogenous change, and learning, right? And what was exciting about this to me is that we could explain all of this stuff without having to mention anything about individual psychology. Right, at the time that paper was published, people were saying, well, micro foundations, it's really, you have to reduce everything to the way individuals think and react and habits. It was like, you can completely forget the individual and still produce these phenomena. So that's interesting to me. Now, in the 2020 version of this, we discovered, and I'll talk more about this one, that incremental variations, the kind of drift we were talking about here, can lead to irreversible phase changes. And this happens over a very wide range of conditions. Right? So without having to collect data on a bunch of different organizations, you just say, hey, any organization, and after a phase change, these routines are very likely to be stable and locked in, right? And this was entirely unexpected. I can remember I was sitting at my dining room table, which is right here, and I ran the code and I said, holy shit, what the hell is that? It's like, so what I did was, instead of plotting the average of 1,000 trajectories, right, just what you typically do in these simulation things, like you run a shitload of them and then you plot the average, then let's just look at one. Let's see what happens when I look at one trajectory. And it looks like this. It's like it starts off and it gets a little bit more complex. And then in the middle, it goes through this chaotic phase. And at the end, it kind of settles down. Right, and so this is this 2020 paper, Dynamics of Drift in Digitized Processes. So you gotta love the alliteration, if nothing else. Don't read the paper, just the title, sweet, right? So, but you get traces like this, right, where it's coming along, there's some drift, whoa, things get out of control, and then bang, it collapses, goes through this phase change. And this happens over a very wide range of conditions. And it's like, Now notice this is going through thousands of iterations. Collecting data like this would be super hard to do. It was no trouble at all on my MacBook, just run it some more. So the thing I want to say though is that is a hypothesis, right? We're generating theory in the sense that we're saying, I think this could happen. I mean, it happens on my MacBook. Does it happen in real life? I got to tell you, there was at least one or two reviewers who were extremely skeptical about this ever happening in real life. Like, okay, that's great. That's the conversation we need to have, because you should close the loop from simulation back to empirical research, right? You got to do that. So, I mean, it generates theory, not findings, right? And so we have this idea about, looking at networks over time. And so Emma Vast and I and my colleague at the University of Rochester, Julie Ryan Wolf, have a research note about this, right? Which is, I don't have time for that today, but the key message out of this is that the simulations that we do should, have this, what Aaron was talking about, that sort of iterative abduction of saying, well, here's something I saw in the real world. What could explain that? What's the mechanism that might be giving rise to that? That's all I got. Thank you. And here's my little hedgehog.
Thank you very much, Brian. And our next presenter is Sheila Miranda, and she will talk about how to develop theory from texture data around the innovation. Oh, sorry. All right, so Sheila, could you please share? Yeah.
Am I good?
Yeah.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. I am really honored to be sharing this virtual podium with this distinguished group and excited to discuss these interesting computational approaches to theory development. I've been reading, all of these papers, and it is just so cool to have this conversation live. One career-long passion for me has been studying meaning, how groups arrive at shared meaning, how organizations manage their identities, how communities make sense of their innovations, how activists frame their claims, right? By the end of this talk, I'm hoping to get more of our audience excited about studying meaning and seeing it as an entirely approachable endeavor. So let me see. So following work by Swidler in 1986, we saw a cultural turn in sociology and then in organizational studies. The cultural turn was the transition from thinking that things constitute culture to culture constitutes things, or that meaning and the material are intertwined, right? So this is sort of the basis for a lot of our work on meaning these days. So the cultural turn foregrounded concepts of symbols, stories, worldviews, identity, logics of action, and framing. And within information systems, we've seen the emergence of concepts such as frames, organizing visions, ideology, theorization, schemas, logics of action. And I should say, I will be glad to share my slides because unlike my well-planned panel mates, my citations are at the end of my slides. So for those of us that study these concepts, we face two problems. The first is that in the past, it has been difficult to quantify meaning. And what this means is that for the vast majority of our colleagues who do quantitative work and believe really, this is that really only quantitative work is legitimate, or perhaps even empirical, that qualitative work is not really empirical. This basically turned them off from the study of meaning. And it made the study of meaning then less legitimate. But even though I do not ascribe to this perspective, I do see the value of empirical qualitative work. I do believe that there is value to the field, that fields progress maybe more quickly if we're able to traverse between different investigative paradigms. And then the second challenge has been that investigations have focused mainly on, what meanings rather than on how meanings emerge and how they evolve. So there is a need for methodological innovations. Now, fortuitously, associated with the cultural turn was a linguistic turn. And this held that social constructions are really more discursive social constructions. And we see this in work by Alverson and Kerman and by Heracles. So at the time of the linguistic turn, there was also this proliferation of textual data. So we started to see a lot more focus on press releases, data coming out of online communities, social media. And this provided us with rich data through which we could understand the role of meaning in structuring our social milieu. So back in 2011, I began this project with Inchan Kim and Jema Summers to investigate the nature and consequences of the organizing vision for social media. And we studied 6 years of annual reports and press releases from the top 50 Fortune companies. And as Aram pointed out in his JRS article, we began by hand coding our text for 6 justification principles. And that same year, Amir Goldberg, a sociologist, had proposed relational class analysis as a way of surfacing shared meaning. And he was really kind and helped me implement a program to automate this process. And we use this to then surface the distinct meanings that companies attributed to social media. From there on, processes around noted was more computational, and we developed monthly metrics of how coherent, clear, continuous, and diverse the organizing vision was, and then how that played into the diffusion of social media. As we were struggling with how to package and present our work to a journal, Natalia and her colleagues began publishing on quantitative grounded theory. And this was amazing for us because it helped us not only structure our own work, but also helped legitimate it to, for our reviewers and for our readers. Then in late 2017, I began a project with Annie Tian, who was an investment banker in a previous life. And I wanted to understand what the heck blockchain was, and she seemed like a really good person to make this journey with. And later, David Wong, who has an amazing grasp on a variety of literature, joined our team. So I remembered hearing about blockchain on NPR as a technology that was a fail-safe record of land ownership and that it was corruption-proof. And I thought, whoa, Annie, this is a very different perspective on blockchain than you have. So we started to think about innovation communities as being not homogeneous, but partitioned into discursive communities. So we collected text transcriptions from newspapers, social media, company press releases, annual reports and such, crowdfunding proposals, government documents, TED Talks, and academic articles. And as we got started, Berente, Seidels, and Safadi's ISR piece on computational grounded theory came out. And that was a really beautiful piece because it provided us with this framework and guidance on how to conduct and present our work. So following DiMaggio, Nag, and Bly in 2013, we use topic modeling to identify frames. And then what we did was to impose a multi-dimensional structure on those frames. And multi-dimensional scaling is a technique that more advocates in the study of meaning. And from that, we surfaced these 23 different blockchain frames that you see. And our next step, or semi-concurrently, what we were doing was to say, okay, we had these different discursive fields, but to what extent are the authors in these different fields really doing stuff with the technology rather than just talking about it, right? So to do that, we looked at author bios at their LinkedIn pages or websites. And from that, we came up with these estimates of the level of material engagement of actors in these different discursive fields. And then typify discursive fields as being either mediated, which means that their experience with the technology was not firsthand, but that it came through someone else, through their sources, if you will. And in contrast, companies, governments, crowdfunding projects, in these fields, actors had firsthand experience with the technology. They were making stuff happen with the technology, or they were enacting the technology, right? So we discriminated between the mediated fields, which were primarily just talking about the technology, so news media, social media, versus the enactment fields that were doing stuff with the technology, and then hybrid fields, which was science and idea evangelists. These were the TED Talks, where people were, some of them were doing stuff firsthand, and others were more observational. And this was sort of a big picture. So what we notice is that the conversation starts in 2012, really focusing on topic 6 or frame 6, which is blockchain, and topic 9, which had to do with cryptocurrencies. And then it broadens to sociopolitical solutions in the TED Talks. And then we move into the right-hand side of our multidimensional model, which gets into the production of blockchain technologies. So over time, we start to see more diverse frames emerge across the different types of fields. And you'll also notice that these frames flow sort of south. So they emerge, if you will, mainly in mediated fields and then get taken up by other fields, even though the mediated fields don't really have firsthand experience with the technology. Okay, so that was our first attempt at making sense of what was going on. And I can tell you the first pictures didn't look nearly as nice, but pictures really helped me think. But from there, what we did was to surface 6 concepts, 4 processes that discursive fields undertook to different extents and 2 states of the overall discourse. So we developed metrics to quantify the extent to which discursive fields engaged in processes of imprinting, imitating, retracting, and foreshadowing. And then the community discourse attained states of diversity and coherence. Right, so we were trying to show that diversity and coherence actually can go together. So I think there's a mindset in our literature that they are somewhat oppositional. So we're still working on what our associate editor calls the forest, that we're too close to the trees. But the story that we're developing is one of an ecology of discourses. That actors' framing autonomy, is limited by their discursive fields, so that actors in corporations are not free to just espouse any particular frame that they want. And that while enactment fields engage in competitive framing moves, mediated fields engage in more mutualistic framing moves, thereby promoting both diversity and coherence in community-wide discourse. So big takeaways. Yes, quantification is sort of the cornerstone of computational grounded theory processes. But how do we keep up? So for me, I've realized that DiMaggio is a great early adopter. He wrote early on about Goldberg's work. He wrote early on about using topic modeling. Moore mentions the political science literature as being early movers, and he is right. Back in the early, 2010, 2011, they were doing really fantastic things with structural topic modeling. So I suggest reading widely, finding communities of practice like this, as well as others, and growing our own community of practice. I also try to pay attention to some of the youngsters in our field, the Malmi Amadorus, Mayur Joshis, who are clearly keeping up with, and I learn a lot from them. And the other thing I suggest is developing toolkits. So, one small example I have is I have an Excel macro that calculates the Heffendal index. And that just reduces the computational load if I want to try something, right? It makes the task less onerous. But for me, visualization is the key. I think of this as sort of a David Kirsch form of distributed cognition, externalizing a current thought into an artifact that becomes then a stepping stone for further insight. I am not so smart that I can hold very complex data in my head and turn it around. But as I start to develop the kind of visuals that I shared, it helps me ask the next question and see the next puzzle piece. And the last point I wanted to make is you have to be willing to re-see and restate your data in different ways as you progress through the project. On the social media schema paper, we started with human coding and then transitioned to more computational techniques. On the blockchain paper, we started with one type of computational analysis and then used that as a way to, as the basis for other techniques. On another project, we started with computational work, word count and dictionary-based approaches, and then moved to mini cases, to kind of zoom in and zoom out of our data, as Iran would say. So I hope I've enticed more of you to study meaning and maybe provided some signage to show you that it is quite doable. And I am so grateful to the organizers of this PDW, to Hila, Iran, and Sami for creating this space to foster this computational grounded theory community of practice. And I will be more than glad to share my slides.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful presentation. And our next presenter is Youngjin Yu from Case Western, and he will share his work on evolutionary dynamics in online platform. So Youngjin, can you share your slide? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so I'm going to do the same thing that Brian did. I was going to do something slightly different, but not wanting to be outdone by Brian, so I decided to set up my green screen. I have a, I'd like to kind of like see the common threads among all the presentations so far. That is that all of us seems to focus on change. All of us seems to focus on the role of time in our social inquiry. And I'd like to take that even to the next level. And that is that, we should really embrace the idea of evolution as core of our theorization. If we don't theorize the evolution of socio-technical systems or human behaviors, and using digital trace data, I think we are just wasting gigantic amount of time and efforts and tools to just replicate, misled, social inquiries of the last, decades, where we see us being more static beings, where in fact, we are not. Some time ago, Theodor Dobzhansky said, nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And, I said something, just imitated him a few years ago, and in the emerging generative digital world, nothing makes sense except in light of evolution. And I'd like to clarify what we mean by evolution. People think that evolution is something like a Darwinian evolution, where fitness of survival of the fittest, or something like a change. We use it in a very colloquial way. So here's a quote, a copy of a book, writing by Richard Dawkins, one of the leaders in evolutionary thinking in biology. So here he begins his book by saying that, we are going to die, and that makes us the lucky ones. And most people are never going to be died because they are never going to be born. The potential people who could have been here in my place, but who will in fact never see the light of the day, outnumber the sand grains of Arabia. Certainly those unborn ghosts include greater poets, scientists, and so forth. We know this because the set of possible people allowed by our DNA so massively exceeds the set of actual people. So I think this is what I'm going to talk about, the differences between actual and real and observed. And this is the lens that critical realists give us to think about it. And the evolutionary thinking is really on the foundation of that. So what I'm arguing is that while we're using, it's great to use digital trace data to think about changes, but what we should really focus on is not what we are observing in the surface level, what biologists would call phylogenetic level, but more on the genetics level. So that's what produces the structure of possibilities, are producing this, what is being observed. And what is real is what is being created in that space of possibilities. So I'm going to use very quickly the remainder of my time for the two empirical contexts where we are trying to do this very quickly. One is the digital platform ecosystem. So what we have been doing is that we begin by, in the evolutionary sort of theoretical efforts, you need to begin with the genetic components. What makes the genetic sequences of these things? And these genetic elements come together, and through the sort of a system biology-like way, produces what is being observed in phenotype level. So we are trying to begin with the genotype, which forms the foundation of the space of possibilities, and then translation mechanism by which the phenotype emerges, and how this phenotype evolves in interaction with the environment. Then sometimes it may affect the genotype level, and there's a whole new science of biology that people actually study that, and so forth. So in this case, we begin by looking at asking, what is fundamental aspect of the genotype level elements that make up the digital platform ecosystem? And we basically said it is a bunch of APIs that are being recombined to create these applications that live inside this ecosystem. So what that allows us to do is that we are able to actually identify different species of apps and how they evolve over time. And I'm just going to give you a fancy visualization because, Cheryl mentioned that visualization is extremely helpful. So this diagram right here is a genotype level and then phenotype level in one diagram that shows in 2014. This is essentially the evolutionary perspective of a population level ecosystem. So it shows all the genes that are available in that ecosystem, and it shows all the species available in that ecosystem. It shows all the instances of within those species. So that's essentially what we are able to discover. And then we could also see how that whole ecosystem changes, and we could see the appearance of new species over time. This is, one could say, extremely atheoretical. We have no clue why this, combination of genes produces this type of species. So here's an opportunity to actually do theory building to understand in what interaction among these species and ecosystems and environment lead to the evolutionary dynamics that produced this type of, final genetic tree evolution of the species. The second one that I'm going to just talk about very quickly is the changes in the behavior routines in open source communities. And what appears to, so this paper, we just have a paper accepted in JIS. It's a forthcoming, and it is looking at how we could use critical realist view in analyzing sequence analysis to understand the actual, the real generative mechanisms. So here, what we are describing is that what we gather in digital trace data is observed, and they are not actual, because actual is a theoretical construct that matters for the theory construction. And what we really want to do is to get to the generative mechanism that produces those actual events. And a lot of times the pure computational exercise is living at this the observed level and recognizing pattern. And I think you need to go beyond that, and then go even beyond that actual discovery to really get to the bottom here, actually generative mechanisms. And so I'm not going to talk about this whole thing, but if you go to open source community like a GitHub, you have artifacts, you have relationship, and you have actors all changing all the times. It gives you a great opportunity to study it. So what you start is that you begin with the most foundational genetic components that make up the behavioral genes, and then you discover the genetic sequences. So sequence of actual the observed events, and then we are trying to use machine learning, the mining tools, to see what are the possible gene candidates. And then we could then put them in a clustering exercise to see that, probabilistically, this group of observed ones are the same kind, they belong to the same gene group, so they are the actuals. And then we could look at the patterns of changes of those actuals over time. So what we are trying to do here is that these temporal patterns, and then there's a whole bunch of really nice dynamic models in system dynamics and even the engineering world, where you could map the cycles and circles and amplifications and so forth. So that's what we mean by generative mechanisms. So does this pattern map to some of those generative mechanisms that we learn? And then we go back and then begin to theorize to see what really lead us to such discoveries. So basically, if you look at this traditional science based on the statistical non-evolutionary model, we begin with the descriptive statistics, and then we're kind of trying to do the structural analysis and longitudinal analysis. Here, the assumption is that the entities don't change. Now here, what we are trying to do that is that starting with a very basic, genetic, the elements, and then trying to understand the generative mechanisms and then coherent narrative, like what is going on here so that we can actually understand. So that's my 10 or 15 minutes or whatever. So thank you.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. And the next presenter is me. So yeah, so I'm gonna share my screen. Oh, where is it? I'm sorry. Yeah, now I will start my presentation. Yeah, so again, I'm Sammy Bean. Yeah, and I'm a PhD candidate at NYU Stern again, and I'm really happy to have a chance to talk about my working process research right after the amazing scholars in our field, and I think it's a great honor for me. And this work, The Role of Discourse and Technologies in Blockchain Diffusion, is based on my job market paper because I'm on the market this year. And it happened to be have a great overlap with the Sharia and Miranda, the wonderful scholars in our field. So I thought that it's again a great honor. And yeah, so this project used texture analysis method for unpacking the diffusion of blockchain shaped by the production of public discourse and evolution of technology. And because I only have like 10 minutes, so I won't talk about the theoretical framing and findings and contributions in detail, but I'll rather focus on which data and methods were used to identify the evolving meaning structure in the public discourse. Right? So this project was inspired by phenomena that when the new technologies were introduced, the discourse were produced to highlight this technology as a next big thing that may transform our society and business like significantly. And indeed, production of such narrative may form collective attention around new technologies, but this narrative can also produce unrealistic promises, which may cause collective disappointment toward these technologies. And the blockchain was not the exception. So since its introduction, the proponents said blockchain will replace the government and central bank and remove all the intermediaries from our economic system, but reality was not, right? So there was a lot of issues around the blockchain technology. However, interestingly, blockchain overcame the collective disappointment and adopted by large institutions such as JP Morgan, and also the Facebook and the different governments try to create digital currencies for payment, drastically shifting from its initial promises. So I thought that it's very interesting. So I became curious about why some technologies are widely adopted in society, despite the widespread skepticism in the field. So to answer this question, prior scholars focused on the role of evolving discourse around the technology that constantly facilitate the interpretation of technology, articulate its values, and legitimizes its use throughout the technology lifecycle. So inspired by this perspective, I investigated how meanings of blockchain technologies were formed and evolved, facilitating its early stage adoption process. So to investigate this question, I scrapped the news articles containing a label blockchain from 2013 to 2020, like Miranda's work. And these articles were published in English from all around the world. And I collected around like 240,000 articles from 2 different databases, Factiva and LexisNexis. And the purpose of this analysis is analyzing evolving meaning structure associated with a label blockchain in the public discourse. So in order to identify the evolving meaning structure, I ran LDA topping model algorithm to our dataset. And the output of LDA is the list of topics that enable scholars to identify and quickly summarize and visualize large corpus without reading the documents in detail. And also the distribution of the topic per each document can be captured and plotted, as you can see from the figure on the right-hand side. And by running LDA, I was able to identify 70 topics. And then I collected 20 representative documents for each topic, showing highest distribution of the topics. And after identifying these representative documents, and I read those documents and matched them with the given topics. And this table shows the overall data structure I gained from the iterative coding process. So first, I assigned first order concept to the topics based on the reading of the representative documents. And then I grouped these topics into more abstract category, assigning the second order theme. And next, I also identify the aggregated dimension, which represents the constructs that influence the involving meaning structure around the blockchain label. And specifically, this analysis allowed me to identify that the meaning structure was shifted, affected by the evolving design and use of technologies, and also the legitimizing effort at the organizational and field level. And also I graphed the historical distribution of each topic to find a point when the shift in meaning structure occurred. And in this process, I could identify 3 different stages where patterns of discourse changed significantly. And this inductive analysis enabled me to identify that significant changes in the meaning structure occurred when unintended consequence of this technology attributed the negative values to the blockchain technology, such as massive hacking and blockchain, and also speculative bubble and criminal activities, and etc. And also I found that initial promise of blockchain technology were often likely to be achieved due to its technical constraints. In response, the new design and use of blockchain technologies were proposed with modified narrative, promising alternative values to sustain the collective attention toward a technology. Therefore, I became interested in identifying values that give meanings to the technology, which makes certain technology legitimate or illegitimate. And prior studies emphasized the role of social values that enable the construction of the meaning of a new product by infusing societal values. So in order to identify the societal values that gives meaning to the blockchain, we conducted semiotic analysis based on the reading of the representative documents we gained from the topic modeling. So our question again was how meaning of blockchain has evolved, creating or weakening the links to the societal values. And based on the semiotic analysis, which analyzes the denotative and connotative meaning in the discourse, we identified the 4 value dimensions which give meaning to the blockchain technology. And specifically, we identified as like the technologies related blockchain and its association with the value dimensions such as Bitcoin, Ledger, ICO, and etc. And as a result, we identified a lot of different societal value dimensions and also sub-dimensions such as incorruptible and corruptible, safe and risky, and efficient and inefficient, and etc. Yeah. And then we try to measure the association between the word blockchain-related technologies and these 4 value dimensions. And for this, we use word embedding methods that calculate the distance between the vectors or vocabularies using cosine similarity. And again, I'm not going to talk about the word embedding in detail, but the key idea is that the terms have related meanings, are located closely in the word embedding space and therefore have strong association. And then using this word embedding and building on this idea and the prior literature, we constructed the value dimensions using word embedding method. And we used them as an axis in the word embedding space and plotted the technology related to the blockchain on this 2-dimensional space. So panel A is the outcome of semiotic analysis. And the panel B is the construction of the value dimension of volatile and stable. And panel C, and I plotted the technology associated with the blockchain along the value dimension of volatile and stable. And as you can see, the Bitcoin is located closely at the volatile dimension, while fiat and stable coin is located closely at the stable dimension. And we can also add another dimension, such as incorruptible and corruptible in this word embedding space and plot the technology features in this 2-dimensional space. So as you can see from this figure, the ledger and the blockchain are located at the corruptible and stable space, but the Bitcoin is, located at the volatile and corruptible space, right? And also this two-dimensional figure shows the historical changes in the association between technical features and values. So for example, ICO, like the initial coin offering, was proposed as a safe and incorruptible investment method in 2016, but it gradually shifted its meaning by moving down to risky and corruptible space, and possibly due to the proliferation of the fraud in ICO space. And also this figure shows that how the association between the value dimension and subdimension, and also the blockchain technologies changed over time between 2013 to 2020. And you can match this pattern with the events happening in the ground and then see how these value dimensions and blockchain related technologies are changed over time. Yeah, so overall, my research showed that constant reconfiguration of technologies and values evolves the meaning of blockchain technology and therefore sustain its diffusion process and leading to the adoption of blockchain by large institutions. And my analysis also shows that the meaning of blockchain forms and evolves, shaping and being shaped by their technologies design and use. And I believe that the computational text analysis can help scholars to identify the collective sense-making around the new technologies, not just blockchain, but also any other technologies in the future by a lot of different scholars. I hope so. So thank you very much. And just for like the quick advertisement, I'm on the market this year. So any feedback, comments, and questions are welcomed after the PDW. And also my other work was presented at the symposium in which I served as an organizer as well. So that is the theorizing the role of technologies during the COVID-19 pandemic. So if you are interested, then you can see my recordings and my presentations in this session. So thank you very much for listening. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Semi.
Yeah.
So we are now, thanks everybody for wonderful presentations. We're now going to move to the breakout room part of our sessions. So we have 9 breakout rooms, and before I open the rooms, I wanted to share this document. So the breakout rooms, we are asking you, besides first, of course, introducing yourself, having a good discussion, hopefully, but also to go to this Google Doc and write down 2 to 3 questions for the upcoming panel. So, and the timing I wanted to inform you about, so it's 12:55 now. Remember, I haven't opened the rooms yet, so don't look for them. And we will wrap up the breakout rooms at, sorry, I was gonna give you exact timing of that, in 25 minutes. So that would be 1:20. Okay, at 1:20, we will take a bio break, which many of you might appreciate, for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to have our panel and a wrap up. So with that said, we now have some problems since I started talking. So I'll try to solve them. 1 second, give me a second, because I think some people left while I introduced breakout rooms. Okay, I need to move people for 1 second, so we actually have.
So
Sorry. I think I have to recreate them, but now, okay. Let me try opening them, and then I will adjust within a few minutes, okay? At least
Natalia, we may want to have a smaller number of breakout rooms, because we now have 25 participants.
Oh, okay.
So 9 rooms will be very, very
okay.
small
I'm
groups.
deleting rooms. So I thought I'm just creating them 10 minutes before, but no, that didn't work either. So as you know from teaching, at least. And I will redo the document while we're doing that part. So I'm gonna move Aaron, you're gonna go with Shayla. Okay. Delete room.
Natalia, can
Yes.
you ask Aaron to join my team? I need to check up with my
Is
situation
he
here.
not? Oh, is he not? I was gonna say he's not responding to your emails. No. Sorry.
I'm very quick
Aaron
at
will
responding.
move then to Yunjin's room. Oh my God, we have big attrition. So hold on a second. I'm still waiting
Sorry.
on dealing with attrition. Okay, let me see. So Aaron is now in your room, Yunjin.
Okay.
I am moving some people around to just have balanced rooms. So we have 3 or 4 people rooms. I think we're finally okay. So right now I'm opening the rooms, and if you feel like, you know, and I'll update the document. Oh, okay. So please join the rooms. Oh, I see. There is unassigned people. That's what's happening. Okay, if you're unassigned, just hold on a second. I'll assign you. Okay, I think everybody is assigned now.
can, Natalia,
Please.
if you
Yes,
want
of
me.
course. I would love for
I think it's a super important question still, probably more important a few years ago. And I can briefly tell you the story of our paper, which Aaron and some other people were so kind to mention earlier. And Natalia was the senior editor on this paper at ISR.
That really helped.
And I guess we all know that, you know, the paper that gets published eventually is a very different paper to the one that you submitted originally. And I have to say that we are very happy with the paper that we're, you know, eventually published. So we're very happy with the entire, you know, review process and all that. But I'm telling this story because the paper that we originally submitted had the explicit purpose of developing legitimization for publishing this type of work. So it was much more of an epistemological paper than of a methodological paper, which is now. I think it's very useful to have the, you know, the methods paper, the primarily methods paper that we have now. But our thinking was, in order for, you know, people to argue for these types of studies, there needs to be some epistemological grounding. So this is why we turned to Habermas and rational reconstruction, and why the lexicon became a very essential element in our paper. So if you ask me what needs to happen in order, you know, to legitimize and also then eventually build bridges to, you know, what's called here traditional fields, and by traditional fields, what I'm understanding here is traditional methods, traditional, you know, ways of traditional practice scripts, traditional ways of conducting research, then we need some epistemological, you know, foundation. That's important. And the other one that's associated with that is the practice scripts. And I think this is where we have a bit of a chicken egg problem, because practice scripts emerge in discourse. And, you know, if you give it some time after, you know, a few years, we know this is how you do computationally intensive, as I would call it, you know, theory development. But if you're the first, you don't know how that actually works. And that's a chicken egg sort of situation. But I think through a mix of methodological and perhaps also epistemological publications, and Aaron, I think you can talk about that, because this is at least my reading of your JS paper as well, to, you know, provide such ground basically, plus the development over time as we enact practice scripts is what gives legitimization to these, you know, types of works, and then eventually probably leads to some type of convergence with what's called traditional fields here. So that would be my first reaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Does anybody else want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I have a short comment on this myself. I will say that given the kind of process theory that I was talking about, and this kind of narrative versus scientific point of view, there's a lot of work that can be done, and to a degree has been done, with computational process theory, where it helps discover, like as kind of Brian said in one of his things, like if you're there, even in some of his papers, he's there on the ground in the hospitals or what have you, kind of doing interviews, but without this computational kind of data collection, he couldn't see the overall pattern. But then he can kind of go back to the human beings and say, like, you know, given this pattern that I saw using the trace data, like, does it jive with what's going on the ground? And I think from a kind of like the traditional field here being qualitative studies, we don't always have to justify things with like statistical models or with charts, but we can like qualify things like with quotes and with kind of like our, you know, justification of us as researchers kind of captured the story well, that we're presenting from a qualitative kind of point of view. And I think if we're bringing in computational methods to kind of augment the story that we're already telling, and kind of map out, like, don't just take my word for it, but here's some kind of like visualizations of the trace data, that can kind of both help you do the research, but also sell your research. And in terms of legitimacy, you don't need an extra layer of legitimacy on top of the kind of claims that traditional qualitative researchers already make. I think it's different if most of your research output is this kind of cool graphs and models, which gets a lot of attention, but then kind of going from this kind of cool visualization to the theory itself, maybe there's kind of like a missed step that people kind of stumble on, and then there's kind of some miscommunication with editors. So
well, thanks, Nicholas. I actually want to move to the next question, which is related, but before that, as a senior editor on Stefan's paper, I wanted to say that so to be honest, I don't remember the full history. Only the authors really remembers the whole pain of the process, right? The editor remembers a little less. But of course, you know, this eventual narrowing of the philosophy we're proposing towards kind of a framework, right, if you will, actually what was appealing to the audience. And I think today seeing Shayla use it actually validates that this would get published, right? Because if you think about the past, we had like my own dissertation, I remember trying to publish, and that's when Klein and Myers came out with their, like, this is how you judge qualitative research. And granted, it was a particular type of qualitative research that they were writing about, but really helped Emma and myself when we wrote our MISQ paper 2005 to say this, like, we're hitting these bullets, right? So this creating this evaluative frame, which I know we already have for grounded theory, which turns out to be, as usual, both enabling and constraining, right? So now you, Stefan, and your colleagues created a frame which is going to constrain some of us if we don't follow it, but it does help legitimacy building, right? It's now could be seen as a frame. So with that, I'm going to move to the next and relevant question of publishing. Do you want to jump in when publishing comes in, or you want to say it now? Okay, Stefan, go ahead.
No, real quick, I could not agree more, and I'll just do 2 sentences. Yes. I could not agree more, and my learning is, if you had asked me 6 years ago, I would have said, we need some solid epistemological foundation for this type of work. Now I would say, we need to practice script, and we need people enacting it, and that's what's happening. So I fully agree, and this is why I said we're quite happy with the outcome.
I think the associate editor also saw
exactly,
and say, why don't you guys give us a script, right? Which was nice.
Exactly, and when Shayla presented her work, I was like, this is exactly what we had hoped for.
Yay,
so that's beautiful. Thank you.
All worked out. Okay, so next question is about publishing, and I did want to kind of point out we have a lot of people who are in editorial positions. Well, a lot. I don't know, Yunjin has cannot rejoin us, but I know Shayla has been an editor, and Brian and Stefan, and you know, at least others like Aaron have been senior editor. Like, both as authors and as editors, what would you suggest in terms of publishing this stuff? Silence.
I have to agree that the guidance pieces, the legitimacy pieces are invaluable. But I think beyond that, having a community, I know, for example, Andrew has come in and talked to the grounded theory SIG at ISIS, and having those communities that are able to inform the sort of wider community that discourse on what is and what isn't legitimate makes the publication process a lot easier for people like me. So, yes, the artifacts are important, but also the community, which then can say, okay, the Berente, Seidel, and Safadi was wonderful, and now here are some ways we can vary legitimately from that framework, right? So having a community that makes this more of a living document rather than something that will anchor the cumulative tradition on computational grounded theory. I think that is important.
Yeah, great. And Brian, do you want to comment?
Oh, I don't know. What this makes me think of is several years ago, we submitted a paper to Organizational Research Methods, where we were talking about using trace data. And like 2 of the 3 reviewers recommended rejection because they'd never seen data like that. They said, well, this can't be. Let me stand up. We're like, no, this is obviously not useful because, we've never seen sequential data like this from an organization, so reject. Now, that was several years ago. It was probably 2008, maybe.
Oh, okay. That's quite a while.
Yeah, so now I think we get a different reception. So things change a lot, but when Stefan's talking about scripts, like practice scripts, like a model that makes it like, here's what we did, here, and this makes sense because I think that's super useful, and I think it's changing really fast. Like I just had a paper rejected from MISQ, but where I was trying to do this. But the reason was it was a bad paper, man. The idea was bad. I think, and not the method, no one was saying this. People were saying great data, interesting analysis, but so what?
It's just maybe given how important this topic is, maybe like a 1 minute for Aaron and Hila. You published, and of course Brian, I think you're on the forefront of actually having papers accepted that use this. But what makes a paper like this accepted? In particular, I'm thinking of Hila's paper on Wikipedia in the ISR special issue, and that was clearly computational intensive big data paper. So you want to comment?
Yes.
What?
To be honest, we had quite a challenging review process. They invited, so this was ISR special issue on online communities, and at some point they invited 2 more reviewers, because I don't know if one of you were there, so I'm not saying anything good or bad. We passed it successfully, so I cannot complain. But there were 5 reviewers in one of the cycles, basically. So they had their original 3, and they invited 2 more to be able to know how to deal with the different methods, but it passed, like in the sense that I think it is hard sometimes to build the right review teams for such, mixed method, computational, qualitative papers. It was scary as an author, but it worked in the way I think that it reassured the editor, I guess, that the methods are solid and rigor. And I don't know why they were not chosen to begin with, but I guess sometimes I know ASQ is now doing this method panel that for such special papers, for instance, an editor can say, oh, can you please help and check this paper out because it has some unique, methods. Can you tell me what you think? So it could be the journals need to, now Shaila, you're saying that MISQ Quarterly is also going to do some masterclasses for editors. Exactly. I think we need to think more about how do we get the journals not to get scared or to be able to choose the right review team for such unique papers.
Yeah.
And it is about building legitimacy. So, the fact that you all have published, this is wonderful, and we can all, you're paving the way. I think each of these papers is paving the way for more.
So actually, Aaron, I wonder if we could start with you on the next question, because the question is about theory, kind of, I would put it like the usual question about the role of a priori theory, in a sense, abduction, deduction. And there is a next session coming up, I know, another PDW on that. But within the context of computational social science that we're talking about, in our breakout room, people were even surprised that, Brian, you sort of started with data, like, is it legitimate? Well, there is a kind of question, but you had a key concept of routines, right? So I actually wanted to ask Aaron, because I know from his work often does have a significant theoretical component from prior literature, but also strong computational tools. You want to comment?
Well, so I wrote specifically about this in my my JIS paper, right? And I think the point that I tried to make there, which is not really my point, which is based on work in sociology and then theorizing there, is that you have to differentiate between the context of discovery and the context of justification in writing up scientific research, right? Meaning that I think that when you actually do this, when you're in the sausage factory, so to speak, trying to figure things out, it doesn't make sense to ask whether theory is first or whether data is first, right? It all occurs at the same time, and they both provoke each other in various ways. Like theories you have, they provoke data inquiry, and data you find, they provoke searches for theory, et cetera, right? So I think in the context of discovery, I kind of reject this whole question. There is no first, right? They all happen at the same time. And I think that's fine. But then there is the context of justification, which is how do you explain this to other people? And I think that's completely different. And sometimes I tell my doctoral students that, I don't want to read your diary. I want to read the memoir, right? There's this account.
Ooh, that's good.
That's established after the fact. That makes it easier for people to understand what's the logical, evidential sort of line throughout your entire argument, the analysis, the evidence, etc. that's helpful for people to understand what it is that you're trying to say and the evidence that you marshal in sort of defense of that that argument. And there, it's very important whether theory comes first or data comes first, right? And I think, pragmatically speaking, you have to find a genre and you have to write in that genre, right? Because if your paper is completely unique and nobody's ever seen a paper like yours before, you're going to struggle getting it published, right? So a lot of times that means putting a lot of theory up front, and maybe even writing it up as a hypothesis testing study, even if that's not the way it occurred. I'm fine with that, because the hypothesis testing template is a way of explaining a set of ideas and the evidence that is attached to those ideas in a way easy for a lot of people, and it's easy for people to consume, right? And I think, like, we idealize the natural sciences and think that they test hypotheses all the time, and that's just not how a lot of natural science happen. I mean, Pickering has illustrated very clearly in physics that that's not how they do. My parents-in-law, they do a lot of exploratory work, and they even publish exploratory work in biology that's written up almost like a sort of a grounded theory type study, right? So
I know Stefan wants to jump in. Actually, you said a lot of things that lots of us have strong reaction to. I was going to say that actually in the piece that I wrote for MySQ in 2021 about grounded theory, I actually made explicit calls that we should have part of the diary, or like at least honest memoir, and about where your theory came from. So personally, I take a very strong stance against what you said. So we have a bit of a debate, and I must say that Andrew Burton-Jones has agreed with me. So
well, I mean, and that goes back to my other point. You have to establish a genre, right? So if the people you're writing to read this has that point of view, then those are the rules of that sort of local
I was going to say that we can keep playing the game as a genre is part of what's institutionalized and legitimate, right, and never fight it. I guess what I was trying to say is that at some point it hurts our scholarship and it's worth fighting. That's kind of where we are. So, okay, Stefan, then Brian. Sorry, I hijacked for a minute.
No, thank you. What you just said resonates quite well with me, and I think this post hoc rationalization is very dangerous. And what's happened with hypothetical deductive sort of research is what we now call harking, hypothesis after research is known. And this is actually against the epistemological tenets of that sort of research. And I personally have a problem with that. And I think we should not make the exact same mistake with the type of research we're doing now. And when we talk about legitimacy here, I think it's exactly the point. The point is to provide practice scripts and foundations so that people can report faithfully. And if it was messy, right, it was messy, right? It was iterative. And if you can't even figure out what was first, write it in the paper. That would be my suggestion. Is it difficult to get that published because these practice scripts have not yet penetrated into, our repertoire of, evaluating research probably, and perhaps conducting research? That's a different story. But I think this should be our ultimate goal. I understand your reasoning, but I'm with Natalia here. I think no.
Brian.
Well, the thing I was going to react to is the idea, not just of genre, but of like, who is the conversant? Like, who are you reacting to? What conversation are you entering? And I have trouble with that. It's hard to pick ideally it's a theoretical conversant. So the best one is, you think the world looks like this, but really it looks like that. And the reason I know is because of my data. That's a very powerful thing to be able to say. So, and because of my data, that's where the computational tools, the kind of work that Semi was presenting, like, I'm blown away. And Shella, both of you guys are like, it's like, you can't see that. You know what I mean? You can't sit there in the library and read or have a team of undergraduates coding and see the things that you guys can see. It's just not possible. So that's where, you think the world's like this, but you've got that power on your side. So that's because of the conversant almost more than the genre. Although I agree with Stefan that practice script, the idea of saying, we used this, we did that, we transformed it, and now we're presenting it. You got to have that. The other thing was the confessional. What I'm hearing Natalia and saying is, tell us a little bit about how you did this. It's interesting. I think that's really valuable for us to all learn from each other about whether it's in an appendix or in the, but anyway, I'll stop.
I think it could be just to reconcile these views. Like, I kind of like Aaron's analogy of a diary versus memoir, but at least an honest memoir, right? There are fake memoirs. This never quite happens this way. Like, why don't we strive for because what I was proposing in that little thought piece was that we actually do, as part of the methods, ask people to say where the theory came from. So it's like maybe even one paragraph, and then we learn like this is kind of where the theory came from. And so my pitch was that it would help advance our field, because we would know, like, this is very valuable knowledge, not for juniors, for seniors, so it could be judged as sort of, this is sort of giving us an epistemic ground behind this knowledge. That's, I personally believe, would be valuable for quant. So I used examples of hypothetical deductive quantitative papers to argue that had we known how they came about, we would actually have learned a lesson for how these good, powerful papers come from, because it's high impact papers. I use Davis's technology, TAM and Brynjolfsson and Hitt as my examples. My only point is that I don't know, I think we're quite far from it, but to just fold our hands and say, let's just do hypothesis testing that gets published. Nah, sorry.
I have to butt in and respond here, right? Because what I was arguing in my JS paper, beyond the context of discovery and justification, is that abductive research processes are continuous processes of generating and testing hypotheses, right? So if you're going to write up that honest memoir of what happened, right, you probably have to acknowledge that at some point there were various sort of propositions or hypotheses that were presented as part of your research process that were either confirmed or disconfirmed, and that is part of the abductive process, right? And sometimes that can be represented in the writing up of the paper. There are certain papers I've seen which, for example, have a qualitative piece up front, which they use to identify a set of hypotheses, and then those hypotheses are tested using qualitative data in the latter part of the paper, right? So I think you can definitely use the hypotheses in a thoughtful manner.
Yeah, I actually agree. The point is just to be authentic, right? That's what we're trying to get to. Stefan, we have total 3 minutes left, so maybe one very quick comment, Stefan.
I don't want to take away everyone else's time, so if anyone else wants to.
Well, officially we had Aaron wrapping up for 10 minutes. I don't know if Aaron, so we didn't get to this question of sharing tools, which I just gonna say Brian has done a tremendous job of sharing his tools, if anything, advertising them every opportunity. So I think you showcase that we should do that. I hope the rest of us kind of also do that when we publish and say, here is the generalizable, reusable stuff we can do.
Can I just say, the thing that motivated that question was listening to Sheila and Semi